All right, plan for today is to keep talking about stress, and we're going to focus a little more on female gender role stress today. So let me go ahead and get my PowerPoint set up here. Anybody have any questions on the previous lecture before we get started? Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is where we left off at our last class. And so let's talk a little bit more about social media. I know some of you said during the last class that you feel like some social media actually kind of distances you from other people. And if it does that, it's oftentimes just because people are not having face-to-face interactions. We know that, and there's quite a bit of research looking at how through social media, people can bully other people anonymously, which is a little different than, say, historically bullying somebody face-to-face. And that bullying is especially pernicious and bad for individuals because a couple things are happening. It's easier to get to bully without people knowing who you are. But when it's posted on social media, the victim of that bullying is, it's made public. And that victim can actually go back and revisit and see that bullying happening over and over again. And so we know that's especially harmful. There's this really horrible thing that happens to many women in social media. And I've written about this when we get to the book later on in the semester, and it's called body snarking. And body snarking is when it's usually popular individuals, so like an actor or a politician, where individuals critique their appearance. They're publicly critiquing their appearance. And so that's the body snarking. It's a really horrible kind of thing. And women are victims of this. Men are very rarely victims of the body snarking. There's even some research on individuals getting addicted to likes. We did a study years ago where we looked at Instagram posts, and we found that individuals who reported that they would take down a post if it didn't get enough likes had lower self-esteem than individuals with higher self-esteem. And so that makes a little bit of sense, kind of feeling like they need that. So feeling that rejection if others don't like. Smartphones, people, I know back in the day before the pandemic, when I would go to a restaurant and eat at a restaurant, I always found it really interesting how often families or couples would be sitting in a restaurant and everybody's on their phone. Like they're sitting together and could be eating together, could be interacting with one another, but everybody caught up in their phones. And then there's an issue with using social media, smartphones, iPads, technology to kind of babysit children and just to keep children occupied and engaged. Okay, so some modern issues that you all deal with that I did not have to deal with when I was younger. Okay, so now we're gonna switch and talk a little bit about the stressors that are unique to women and gender role stress. If you go into the DSM-5, and I know this is not a class in abnormal psychology, many of you have had abnormal psychology, some of you have not, so I don't want to assume that those of you who haven't understand the DSM, but the DSM is kind of the mental health provider's Bible. It lists all of the different psychological disorders. And if you were to go into the DSM and take a look at patterns, we tend to see women having certain psychological disorders more frequently and men having other kinds of psychological disorders more frequently. There is overlap. So as an example, both men and women do get depressed. Men have eating disorders at times, but there does tend to be a particular type of separation and a pattern. In general, men, when they get very distressed and develop a psychological disorder, we call the disorders that they tend to get externalizing disorders, okay, where the distress gets acted out in some way. So an example would be alcohol or drug abuse, impulse control disorders, ADHD and conduct disorder, sexual paraphilias where they're doing the really weird kind of stuff sexually, and in enuresis is bedwetting, but in general, externalizing disorders. In In general, for females, we're more likely to see women when they get really distressed and develop psychological disorders. We oftentimes call them internalizing disorders. The distress gets taken out within them. And so an example of psychological disorders that are more common in women, women more likely to get depression compared to men, more likely to have certain anxiety disorders compared to men, more likely to have eating disorders compared to men. The somatization disorder we've already talked about, that would be where the psychological distress gets manifested in issues in the body, in the physical body. So it could be pain, it could be irritable bowel syndrome, it could be unexplained headaches, things like that. And then certain personality disorders women see more frequently. So if we take a look at these patterns and we kind of step back and we ask why, there's a lot going on. It's multifactorial. We can't just put our finger on one thing. There are certainly biological differences. And when I think about, I go back to that externalizing, internalizing, we know that boys and men have more testosterone than women. We women do have testosterone. It's actually pretty influential in our sex drive, as an example, but men have much more testosterone proportion in their bodies than women do. Testosterone tends to be energizing, okay? Whereas our females, our higher levels of estrogen tend to make us more nurturing, pay attention to other people and other people's emotions. It's part of the reason why women tend to have more empathy. And the reason why women, we think evolutionarily have more empathy is that our babies, human babies, it takes them up to about 2 years of development before they have words to tell you what they need. And so one way of thinking about our heightened sense of empathy is that it would make sense that we would be able to read a baby's nonverbals and hear babies' cries and know what babies need. Okay, it makes some sense that way. Men have empathy too, but women tend to just have more. And so we could certainly look at the hormonal and the biological differences there. From a socialization perspective, as an example, oftentimes little boys are told that they're not supposed to cry, okay? Whereas it's much more acceptable for little girls to cry, as an example. So all of those forces, the tendency for us to wanna put little girls in pink clothes and little boys in blue clothes, all of that kind of stuff is more cultural and is more socialized, those differences. Sometimes we have flexibility in cross-gender behavior. Like we women are able to, if we wish, to wear skirts, if we wish, we can wear pants. As an example, men tend to have less flexibility with that kind of stuff. The clinician's gender bias, I'll just give you an example of this. And of course, I try not to do this, but an example would be, let's say I have a male patient in front of me and he's very irritable. And I find out that he's having difficulty sleeping. And so he tells me that he drinks a bunch of beer every night to knock himself out and put himself to sleep. A clinician's diagnosis for him is likely to be alcohol dependency. Let's say, on the other hand, I've got a woman in front of me. She cries throughout the interview and she tells me at some point in time she has difficulty sleeping. So sometimes she drinks wine at night to help her relax and fall asleep. Clinician's diagnosis for her is likely going to be depression, as an example. Okay. Now we're not supposed to have those biases, but I'm just telling you that oftentimes those biases exist. Okay. And we see when males and females in general, I'm trying not to stereotype here, but in general, when they are in distress, they tend to present differently. So an example would be a woman being really upset and crying, a man being really upset and then translating that into anger towards others. Okay, so different kind of presentational style. Okay. So now I want us thinking, and I know you all have the PowerPoints, but I want you to come up with, what do you feel like are some stressors that are unique to girls and women? And let's hear some thoughts.
I feel like just the menstrual cycle in general is added stress.
Yes, you got it. You got it. So there could be just fluctuating emotions. There could be pain, temporary pain. Yeah. And then just the expense, right? Just, the stuff that women have to buy that guys don't have to buy. Yeah. And then there's issues with what's called pink taxes. Okay, what else?
Just like birth control in general, having to, if you get pregnant, it's really majority of the time the woman is the woman is the one that has to deal with all of that versus the man. So
yeah, controlling reproduction in heterosexual relationships, you got it. And when later on in the semester, one of the things that we're going to talk about that I wrote about is the double standard. And I absolutely hate the double standard for heterosexual individuals. Like it's acceptable for guys to have sex and lots of sexual partners. It's not as acceptable in our culture for women to do the same. But some of the roots of that double standard have to do with the consequences for sex for women. It's very different than the potential consequences for sex for men. So it kind of makes some sense on a biological level there. Other thoughts? Anybody?
I was gonna say, like, can you hear me? I don't know if it's working.
I
Oh,
can.
okay, gotcha. I know it applies to both like men and women, but I was gonna say like just like walking alone or running alone, because like I know girls like tend to go to the bathroom together, for instance, or at least like I do with my friend group. Like I don't like going out pretty much alone, so like I guess just having some extra safety, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that today too. We have to worry about safety in ways that a lot of guys just don't worry about safety. Yeah. I attended I'll get to this in a little bit. We'll talk about it. But I've got a story to kind of tell you about that. So the American Psychological Association, when they were, there was a task force appointed to kind of take a look at women's stress and women's issues. And these are a lot of the things that they ended up finding that certainly there's the genetic, the hormonal part that we just talked about, like with the menstrual cycle. Women are more likely to face poverty. We talked about that in the beginning lecture, more likely to be victims of abuse and sexual assault. More women are single parents, and that is particularly stressful right now during the pandemic for single moms. Coping styles differ. Men are a little more likely to try to distract when they are distressed, and women are a little more likely to do this thing called ruminate. And we know rumination is a sign of anxiety and it's a risk factor for depression. But rumination is when we take something bad that we're going through and we just go over and over and over it in our head. And then women do this really interesting kind of thing that men tend not to do. They like to, it's called co-ruminate. They like to get with their friends and go over and over and over the bad stuff. Okay. I've got a friend who does a bit of that oftentimes we will have a conversation and something will come up that I can tell she's really upset about. And then it comes up again, and then it comes up again. And it's one of those, like, she's going through that process of kind of processing that type of thing. Sexism and discrimination, women are still making, and this is pre-pandemic, 80 cents to every male dollar. Women of color, I think it's closer to like 64 cents for a white male dollar. So there's clearly sexism and discrimination going on. But I want to add a point here. A couple of years ago, I went and I did some training in the American Psychological Association, where they hold these workshops and these training for women to try to help women promote their careers. And one of the things that I learned in that workshop is that women tend to really suck at negotiating. And the reason why women suck at negotiating is because we want to appear nice. We don't want to appear pushy, all that kind of stuff. But that is very problematic for us because men, because they're more willing to negotiate and it's expected that they negotiate, they tend to start at a starter salary higher than women. And then they're more likely to go and ask for promotions and ask for more money than women are. And that 80 cents to female for a male dollar, some of that is blatant discrimination, but some of that we've got to own. We've got to learn how to be more assertive, and we need to know how to negotiate more thoroughly to make sure that that doesn't happen to us. Whether or not we fall into a traditional role or a more, a traditional role would be more of, say, wanting to get married, have children, stay at home, caretake for the house and the children. A more modern role would be a person who, even if they have children and even if they're partnered, wants to work outside of the home type of thing. And we know when we've studied women and women's happiness, we know if women are where they want to be, they are happy. So if they're at home with a baby, but they really want to be back in their career in the workforce, they're going to be unhappy. If they feel like they're forced to go into the workforce and work when they really want to be at home with a child, then they're unhappy. And so again, advice for young women, I think when we partner, we want to think about what's going to be best for us. And are we going to be able to do what feels right for us in relationships? The role strain piece to it is when women get, I call it sandwiched, when let's say they're caretaking for an elderly family member and then they're also caretaking for children. Caretaking can be absolutely draining and exhausting. And so individuals, when they get sandwiched in that way, that can be particularly stressful for women. And there are a lot more women who are in those roles, caretaking for children, caretaking for elderly. There's even research, and this just sounds horrible, but there's even research where divorced women end up caretaking for ex-husband in illness at the end of life. And it's like, oh man, that would be rough having to do that. Okay, so the APA was able to certainly determine there are reasons why women experience some unique stress. In this Nolen-Hoeksema study, one of the things that they do is nowadays people would be in the study on their smartphone and tracking their behavior on the smartphone. In the old days, they used to page people and ask, what are you doing right now? And so you get kind of real-time behavioral data out of those types of studies. And what they found when the study was conducted, women were working outside the home about 31 hours a week, men 39. Women were doing about 12 hours of housework a week, men were doing about 9. Women were spending about 22 hours doing childcare compared to 10 for men. 9 hours for women caring for 6 individuals and about 3 hours a week for men. And that's a total of 74 hours compared to 61 hours, okay? I still remember a friend of mine talking about a conversation with her husband where she would end up bathing the children most evenings, and she wasn't trying to encourage him to do some of the childcare in the evenings, like, can you bathe the kids tonight? And his response, according to her, his response was, don't you want to spend time with your children? Don't you want to enjoy your children in the bubbles in the bathtub? And, and her response back was like, yes, I do enjoy at times giving my children a bath and I enjoy spending time with my children, but sometimes it's just a chore, And so you can kind of see this type of thing. One of my favorite pieces of data when you ask, and again, I don't mean to make everything about heterosexual couples in this, but I do want to talk about this data. If you ask heterosexual couples what percentage of the housework they each do, they tend to report they do 80%. That's 80% each. That's 160%. That is a clean household, isn't it? Right? But what's going on there? According to the Nolen-Hoeksema, when you collect their behavior in real time, the women are doing more housework than the men. But we tend to pay attention to what we do. Like, I know if I've done the dishes, I've done the vacuuming, I've done the mowing, that kind of thing. And then if there's a significant other, they're paying attention to what they're doing. But rarely do we pay attention to what the others are doing. Okay. I do want to talk about the second shift study, though. And I don't think I have it. No, I don't have data on that. There's some really interesting research where you have individuals in a study and they track their cortisol levels through intermittent blood draws all throughout the day and night. There's a way you can kind of rig that up and you can kind of collect that and you can actually look at from a biological perspective on how much stress that they are experiencing. And what you see is men and women's cortisol levels are rather equivalent all throughout the day until 5 o'clock. And then this really interesting thing tends to happen around 5 o'clock for most men and women. The men's cortisol levels tend to decline, which is an indicator that they are now more relaxed and less stressed. The women's cortisol levels on average, however, increased at 5 o'clock in the evening. And that, for a lot of women, that's the second shift. It's that if putting in work, like a work day, like an 8-hour work day kind of thing, then going home at 5 o'clock in the evening, 5:30 in the evening, and then there's all this other stuff to do. Children to take care of, if there are children in the home, household to take care of, pets to take care of, that kind of stuff. Okay. And so even on a biological level, we have measured this interesting phenomenon. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some work that I was involved in my graduate program. I was on a research team that did a lot of research on masculinity, and they were all men except for me and this one woman, Betty Gillespie, on this particular team. And Betty and I wanted to take what was going on the research team related to masculinity and men's stress, and we wanted to apply it to women and try to understand women's stress more uniquely. In my undergrad, I had focused on gender roles and how gender roles are associated with body image and how gender roles are associated with eating disorders. And so that was my area of interest. And I wanted to see if we could figure out how to measure women's stress, women's unique stress. Is that a way that we could predict women's vulnerability for body image issues and eating disorders? Okay, so what we did, the scale that we created was called the Feminine Gender Role Stress Scale. And we interviewed a bunch of women and we asked them, tell me about the things that are stressful in your life. And from those interviews, we started gleaning content and we started putting the content into test items, like scale items. And then after we had all of this, we had this big, huge list of all of these scale items. We gave that survey out to a bunch of men and women. And they would rate each of those particular, if this event happened to you, how stressful would that be on a Likert continuum? And I think it was like from 1 to 7 on a Likert. So 7 would be, oh, terribly stressful. 1 would be no big deal. Then we took those scale items and any test item that was not significantly different between the men and women, we got rid of, meaning it was a generic stressor. But any of the test items where the women reported that that would be so much more stressful for them, significantly more stressful than the men, we kept those test items. Okay, so then we, the scale gets smaller and smaller over time in this statistical process. But then what we get are just test items that are uniquely stressful to women that would be no big deal if these events happen to men. Then what we do is we took the scale and again, we gave it to a bunch of women again, and then we ran this thing called a factor analysis. And what a factor analysis does is it takes test items that tend to intercorrelate and load into these factors or load into these particular themes. Got it? Okay, and then here's what we ended up getting. The scale ended up having 5 different factors, 5 different themes, and you all have already brought up some of this stuff, so this is not going to be too surprising. The first factor, this is the factor name right here, and then this is just one example item I've given for each of these, but keep in mind there are a bunch of items underneath each of these factors, okay? So the first one, we ended up naming emotional detachment. And so an example being having others believe that you're emotionally cold. Women are supposed to be warm and fuzzy, and there's this really interesting thing. Women are supposed to be smiling all the time. Smile for me. And rarely do we ask boys and men, smile for me, right? And it's kind of almost like if we took this to a stereotype, it must be like a cheerleader type of thing, okay? What do we call her? Somebody give me the word. That woman who's that cold-hearted. What do we call her? We're adults. Huh? Say it again.
A bitch.
Yes, a bitch. Yeah. When there's a book written by, she's probably passed away, but her name is Dr. Joyce Brothers. And she was a feminist psychologist that wrote a lot of self-help books for women. And one of her books was called, and I've just planted this in my head. If you're called a bitch, say thank you. And her take on that was, if you're called a bitch, you are doing something outside of a traditional feminine gender role, meaning you're being more flexible in your behavior. I think most of us would not want to be called a bitch, but I like that reframe. I like that ability of sort of taking something that is meant to harm us and trying to frame it a little differently. Okay, so that's the emotional detachment. The second factor that fell out, what we ended up calling physical unattractiveness. And we're going to spend a lot of time at the second half of the semester talking about these kinds of issues for women when we go through the book. And an example test item on this one was wearing a bathing suit in public. I still remember the day. Betsy and I got our data, the factor analysis stuff, and we're sitting in this big conference room, and it's all these men, male professor, all these male doctoral students, and then it's just us two women. And we're really excited to see our data and to start, looking at these factor themes and put names on them. And I still remember discussing this when we got to this test item. The men were perplexed. They were like, what are you wearing a bathing suit in public, like in the grocery store, like at the post office, in a class? What are you talking about? And Betsy and I were like, no, this is that body image kind of stuff that so many of us women have been raised to be more self-conscious about our bodies. And there's a little bit of a phenomenon that happens for some women that when they're in a bathing suit, it's just sort of this, like, I'm half naked, I'm half naked, I'm half naked, I'm half naked, that kind of self-consciousness that you just don't see when a guy's in, are they still called swim trunks? When a guy's in swim trunks at the beach or at the pool, they're usually like just having a good day kind of thing. And women tend to carry with them more of that kind of self-consciousness. Added to that, we're going to get to this in a minute, added to that, women knowing that if they're clothed like wearing a bathing suit, they oftentimes are objectified and sexualized. And I know particularly for teenage girls, that can be a really uncomfortable transition of sort of like being this carefree girl to all of a sudden bodies developing and boys and men are looking at their bodies in a different way. That can be really hard for some women to be able to cope with. So anyways, the two women on the team, we were like, no, like in an appropriate place, like a beach or a pool, that type of thing, not in some kind of weird place like the grocery store. Okay, questions there? Fear of victimization, you all already brought this up. Example item here, moving to a new city or town alone. All right, people in my class. These are my keys. What am I doing? Somebody tell me what this is and what I'm doing.
It's basically making a weapon in case you need to hit someone.
Thank you, Sophie. Yes. Yeah, and a lot of women know about this. I saw a stand-up comic. I love watching stand-up comedy. I saw a stand-up comic at one point in time. A woman and her boyfriend, they're walking out at night in a parking lot, and she gets in her purse and she gets her keys out and she does this. And his response is like, what are you doing? Like, he didn't understand it. She's like, yeah, I'm creating a weapon. And he starts mocking her and he's like, what do you need a weapon? Well, you're walking with me, you're in the parking lot. And her response to him was, dude, I travel with a vagina. Right? And that is that worry that a lot of women have, and all of that stuff that women do to try not to get raped. Okay. And I attended this workshop on interpersonal violence. There were a bunch of women and men in the audience, and the person who was leading it gets on this whiteboard and she prompts the women. She's like, okay, ladies, tell me things that you do every day so as not to get raped. And it was amazing. The audience, people are like, I do this, 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 I do this kind of thing. And then she gets to the men, she gets out a separate whiteboard and she says, men, tell me something that you do on a daily basis to not get raped. And the room was quiet. And I found that to be very powerful, how this factor here is a little bit more of a reality for a lot of individuals. Okay, I want to tell you this story about me on my bike. I was out training one summer on my road bike, and unusual for me, usually I'm with my pack of friends. I was all by myself on this particular day. And I am out in this rural area out here. I'm on a really windy road, and I know there's a vehicle stalled behind me. And it was one of those service trucks like Skyline, Skybest, something like that. And the driver, the dude driving the van, was being very, very courteous to me as a cyclist. And I was very appreciative of that. And it took me a while in the windiness to get to a point where I could see far enough ahead to flag the vehicle around me. And as soon as I got to where I could, not a blind curve, I waved him around. He gave me lots of space. The rule's supposed to be 3 feet. He gave me lots and lots of space. I was very appreciative. But apparently behind that van, the very courteous van that was being very careful and courteous to me, was this old broken down car with a guy in it who was very mad. And he rolls down his window and he crowds me. So like I'm on my bike. I wish if I had thought a little bit more carefully, I would have just braked and pulled up and just stopped. But he's crowding me and he's screaming at me. He's yelling. He's like, some of us here pay taxes and some of us pay for these roads. And he's just really, really upset. And I remember having like an evil thought at one point in time. I kind of see his car and I'm thinking taxes and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, I'm looking at his car and I'm looking at my bike. My bike was worth more than his car. And I'm thinking, hey, dude, I bet you I pay more taxes than you do because I make more money than you do, kind of thing. So he's yelling at me and I'm getting, I'm really upset. And he finally just goes on. And at that point in time, I'm angry. And I should have controlled my emotions a little better, but I get out in the middle of the road and I give him the finger. Like I'm just like riding on my bike, giving him the finger. He sees me and he's up ahead of me now on the road. He pulls over and stops. And that's when I realized I had a friend who, as a cyclist, he had made a vehicle, somebody really mad. And the person pulled over, and right before he approached the car, they opened their car door and flipped him. And so I'm out there in the middle of the road. This car has pulled over. I'm remembering Jimmy's story. That person who flipped Jimmy went to jail. So that was a good thing. Anyways, so I'm out there in the middle of the road. This guy pulls over. And at that point in time, I remember the stand-up comic and I go, I'm traveling with a vagina also. And I just turn around and go the other way. And he left me alone after that. I have learned on the bike, if somebody gets upset, not to get upset myself and to be like, okay, this could get you into trouble kind of thing. And around here in this rural area, you never know it, even if people have guns in their car. So, I mean, I know that could happen in urban areas too, but okay. All right, the fourth factor we ended up calling, and this goes back to the negotiation thing, unassertiveness. We women are socialized to be kind, polite, have empathy, please other people. And so many of us have not been trained in how to be more assertive. I spend a lot of time in therapy with women, helping them realize that if you are giving other people's rights more rights than your own personal rights, then assertiveness training might be needed. Because ideally, when we are assertive, we communicate in a way where we get our needs met and our rights are respected while we're also respecting the rights of others, okay? But where women get themselves into trouble is when they're letting other people around them have all of the rights and they're getting walked over and getting stomped on and that type of thing. So negotiate. Get out there and negotiate. I had a student in my class a couple of years ago after this lecture. She worked in a coffee shop and she went in the next day and asked if she could meet with her boss, and she sat her boss down and she negotiated a raise. I was like, yay, that's a good story. Very good story. One of the former, I can tell you this, when I was training with women at the American Psychological Association, Nadine Caslow, who is the former president of our APA, she told a story that was absolutely fascinating. And she's done a lot of work on assertiveness training for women. When she got her first job at a medical school as a clinical psychologist, she looked up, and a lot of times this information is public, you all. You can do this. There are ways of looking up salaries on this thing called ONET. But find out when you go for particularly your first career job, find out what a going salary is, and make sure by all means, if you decide you want to take that job, that you're getting at least the going salary, if not more than that. So what Dr. Kaslow did before she took her first position out of med school, she looked up how much men and women were being paid in the same job. And keep in mind, this is like 40 years ago, okay? She looked it up and she found out that the job, the salary that was offered to her, and she went and presented this to the person who was offering her the job. She went and said, I don't know if you know this, but your medical school pays your men in comparable jobs much more than your medical school is paying women in comparable jobs. Anyways, the punchline of her story, she negotiated $40,000 more a year than she was offered. Get out there and negotiate, everybody. Ash, you can do that too. Women and men can do that, but get out there and negotiate. And if you think about that, you think about your first career job, that first career job for most people who are professionals compounds itself all across the career. Does that make some sense? So let's say you start out one particular salary, you tend to go up and up and up and up with promotions. So if you're starting out significantly lower than you deserve, you're going to be missing out all throughout your career. Okay. Negotiate. If anybody wants some good books, I've got some books that I could recommend that are really good at helping with that. Okay, the fifth factor ended up being called failed nurturance. And again, this is kind of this idea that we're supposed to be warm and fuzzy and smiling and empathetic and, you know, keeping other people's rights in mind. The example item here is your child is disliked by his or her peers. And so this would be a little bit more of that mom blaming as opposed to dad blaming. I know when my boys were little, I just found it really interesting when they would get in trouble in preschool. They were very, very active young men, lots and lots of energy, which does them really well as adults. And they both like to make other people laugh, and they would get into trouble with that kind of stuff. But they would always call me, preschool, elementary school, they would always call me when they were misbehaving. They never called their dad. And I just found that to be really interesting. Like, oh, okay, the mom's supposed to be responsible for the parenting. Questions here. Got your 5 factors? They make some sense? Unique stressors for women? Yeah. We wanted to see if, I was particularly interested in if FGRS scores on the scale, were related in any way to body image issues or related to eating disorders. And so here's what I did. This was my master's thesis. This was many, many moons ago. I gave the survey out to hundreds of women, and I called back into the lab only the women who scored really high on the scale and women who scored really low on the scale. And then I was tasked with creating some kind of in the lab stressor. And I kept trying to model my stressor off a previous study that we had done with a masculine general stress scale, where in the FGRS lab study to stress the men in real time, what they would do, they would bring the men into the lab, they would sit in this chair, they would wire them to collect heart rate and blood pressure data. And then they would let them sit and get a baseline of their blood pressure. And then they would have the men do this thing called a cold pressor test. And a cold pressor is when you have your participant put their arm in a bucket of cold ice water. I just watched this really cool thing on Netflix recently that found, if you put your hand in a bucket of cold ice water, it is painful and it is stressful. And ethically, when we do this, you can only allow them to keep their hand and their arm in for so long without creating any type of damage. So it's a way of creating pain and stress without damage is what I'm getting at. So it's a thing that psychologists use at times. The Netflix thing that I watched was really funny. Research has found that if you're experiencing pain, like a cold pressor test, if you're cursing, while you're experiencing the pain, you can endure the pain a lot longer than if you were asked not to curse while you're experiencing the pain. And so let it out, y'all. When you experience pain, find your favorite words and just let it out, whatever your favorite curse word might be. Okay, so anyways, in the male condition, what they found is they would have men in the control condition, put your arm in the bucket of ice water, keep it in as long as you can, and the men would be like, okay. In the masculine challenge condition, they had the men put their arm in the bucket of ice water, and they would say, put your arm in the bucket of ice water, keep it in as long as you can. Our research has found that the tougher men are, they can keep their arm in significantly longer. And then that kind of called on their masculinity, and they were like, I'm going to keep it in here forever because I'm that tough. I played around one summer with this cold pressor thing. I brought women into my lab. I had them put their arm in a bucket of ice water. I tried all kinds of manipulations, even telling them I was trying to do a body image challenge. And this makes no sense from a physical level. But I was even telling women things like, put your arm in this bucket of water. Women who are in better physical condition or women with less body fat can keep their arm in significantly longer. I played around with all kinds of different types of manipulations. And basically what kept happening to me, I felt so bad at what I did to these women that summer. They would like put their arm in the bucket of ice water. And as soon as it would hurt, they'd like pull it out and be like, ow, you're mean making me do this, you bitch. That kind of thing. It's just like, ow. And I just found it funny that manipulation worked for the men who were trying to be masculine and tough, but because we women are allowed to show emotions, the women were kind of like, ouch, no, I'm not going to do this. So what I ended up doing, and it took a long time to kind of pilot test this, is what we ended up doing, because I wanted this body image stressor for my feminine challenge. We got this nice looking young male research assistant who wore a white lab coat, who looked very professional in his white lab coat, very medical-like. The women were brought into the lab. They sat in a chair where they got to rest for a while, and they were wired for blood pressure and wired for heart rate. And in the neutral challenge, the male medical student led her through a medical exam where everything was completely closed. It wasn't like a gynecological exam. He tested different things like her eyesight, her hearing, but we made sure that he appropriately touched her exactly the same in the control condition as in the experimental condition. And in the experimental condition, they were told, he told them that he was going to measure their body fat. Okay. And he took some measurements. He did a fake tricep. He had the little calipers where you pinch the back of the tricep and you look at the body fat from these calipers and you put it into a formula. He didn't even calculate their body fat. He just told them that's what he was going to be doing. And then he did some realistic measurements that made it look like he could be calculating their body fat. Okay, so that was the feminine challenge relative to the medical exam. And again, we had to make sure that he appropriately touched them equally in those two conditions, okay, because we wouldn't want that to be the thing that was affecting their blood pressure and their heart rate. So we've got these women, they're high and they're low on FGRS, and then we're putting them, this is a 2x2 study, then we're putting them into either the control condition or we're putting them into the feminine challenge condition. And what we found, women tend to react, we're protected in our blood pressure until around menopause. Estrogen is nice and protective. Estrogen makes our arteries nice and elastic, if that makes sense, whereas men get more hardening of the arteries earlier. And wouldn't it make sense that from an evolutionary perspective, having that elasticity in our arteries is adaptive for if and when we carry a pregnancy? Because during pregnancy, we have to carry a lot more blood volume, not just to feed our bodies, but to feed a fetus. Okay, so estrogen makes them nice and elastic. So women tend not to have problems with blood pressure. And if they do, it tends to be more likely to start in their 40s and their 50s, and particularly postmenopausal. Men, on the other hand, have a lot of reactivity in their blood pressure all throughout their lives. Okay. What we found is that the heart rate of these women, these were the high FGRS women when they were told they were having their body fat percentage taken. Okay. And this got me a little bit closer to, I wonder if being really high in FGRS, feeling very strongly that you're supposed to meet all of those feminine expectations in our culture, could that be related to vulnerability with body image? Could that be related to vulnerability for eating disorders? So the next study that we did is we gave the FGRS scale to a bunch of college women who were considered to be our control group. Then what we did is we got permission in a local psychiatric hospital that had an eating disorders unit to give the FGRS scale to women who were hospitalized in this hospital for a diagnosis of an eating disorder. And then we also were able to give the FGRS scale to women who were hospitalized in this psych hospital, but for a non-eating disorder. And most of those women were in there for depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorder, that kind of thing. And what we found is that the women who had the eating disorder had the highest scores on the FGRS, even higher than the women hospitalized in the psych hospital with a different non-eating disorder diagnosis. And those hospitalized women had significantly higher FGRS scores than the college women. Okay. And so what this kind of translates into is that, and I know I've seen this in my clinical work with women with eating disorders, oftentimes they are really trying to live up to some feminine gender role expectations that have been given to them, either given to them by society, given to them by culture, given to them by their parents, given to them by their teachers and their friends. And that leads us, when we start thinking about working with somebody who has adopted these hazardous feminine expectations, that lends itself to a feminist perspective in therapy. Okay, with the idea of, yes, I'm going to try to help this person with the understanding that a lot of individuals have eating disorders because they've inherited these unhealthy expectations. And from a feminist perspective, we want to empower them and help them become empowered and stronger, feel like they have more agency in their lives, feel like that they can reap their self-esteem and reap their worth from things beyond what their bodies look like, as an example, or what their appearance looks like. And so it makes a lot of sense. There are quite a few clinicians out there, quite a few researchers who really believe that when we're treating eating disorders, it deserves a feminist approach, as well as using an evidence-based therapy. So using cognitive behavioral therapy, using interpersonal therapy, using acceptance and commitment therapy, that kind of thing. Questions here for anybody? Okay. Okay, so let's talk about stress management and working with women who are experiencing a lot of stress. A lot of this applies to men too. One of the things that I have found really interesting, and this kind of gets to that traditional feminine role also, is so frequently in my private practice and working clinically with women, I'm simply giving them permission to self-care. Okay. A lot of times women are stressed because they're caring for everybody else without sort of realizing, hey, I'm important too. My self-care is important too. My friend, Dr. Catherine Cook-Katona, has developed a mindful self-care scale. If any of you all want a copy of that, email me and I can send you the mindful self-care scale. I like to use, for those of you who've been on an airplane before, they run this safety video, or the flight attendants are modeling it for you up in front. And they say, should the cabin lose air pressure, that mask and is going to fall down. And then they say, put yours on first before you assist others. Okay. And I love that analogy, because doesn't it make sense that if you're busy, all the children on the plane, you're giving them their masks and putting it on, and you don't have enough air and you pass out, you're not going to be helpful whatsoever. But if you put that mask on and you're getting your oxygen, even though the plane's going to crash anyways, you're getting your oxygen, right? It makes sense that you get your oxygen before you give oxygen to others. And so for a lot of individuals, it's that idea of, and it's kind of like there's a Southern saying too, some of you have heard this: if mama ain't happy, tain't nobody happy, right? It's that if women take care of themselves, they're going to have more to give, and they're going to be healthier themselves than if they're just so busy caring for everybody else. It's part of the reason why women who get sandwiched into caretaking for the elderly and caretaking for children get so exhausted. That's a formula for burnout. Prioritizing relationships and social support. I have a lot of friends, keeping in mind my age and middle life here, a lot of friends who have said that over time they learned if they were in any kind of toxic relationships or toxic friendships, to know how to get out of them, to know how to end those relationships, and making sure that they are surrounded by individuals that are like them, individuals where there's lots of give and take in the relationship. I know personally in my experience, I've had some friendships over time that were quite draining because I was a friend with somebody. Part of my interest in eating disorders, as an example, I had a roommate in college who had a very serious eating disorder, who was quite depressed, and she was living quite a very stressful lifestyle. And I found her stress to feel quite contagious. It was very stressful to care about somebody and to try to be helping somebody who was in such a rough condition, as an example. I have learned over time that if I'm in those relationships where I feel like I'm giving, but I'm not getting much in return, I don't keep those friendships. I very much enjoy having friendships with people around me where there's lots of give and take. And most of my friends are smart, really funny, pretty happy people. And I'm blessed that way. Smoking and alcohol use can be bad for anybody, so I've got that on there. Exercising on a regular basis, so you're going to see in one of the chapters of my book, I review successful interventions for improving self-esteem and body image. Some of you in here may have done Girls on the Run as an example. Anybody participate in Girls on the Run? I'm not getting any. Okay.
I did.
Who's that?
Me, Peyton. I did Girls on the Run.
Oh, okay. Hey, Peyton. Yeah, the data on Girls on the Run's really good. It's a intervention program. It's like a mentoring program where you get like older teenage mentors or young 20s mentors, and they work with these younger girls, and they do all kinds of different types of self-esteem raising interventions, things like that. And then they run together periodically, and then at the end everybody runs a 5K together, and they kind of celebrate that movement. And one of the things that you're going to see a little bit later in the semester, if individuals are exercising because it makes them feel good, or they're exercising because they're competing in sports, that's called body as process. And body as process is associated with high self-esteem. The flip side of that would be somebody who's exercising, particularly exercising compulsively, trying to lose weight, trying to maintain weight that is suppressed. That is called body as object. So that would be exercising to get a particular look, which is very different from exercising because it makes somebody feel good, or they're exercising because they're training in sports competition. My friend, Dr. Catherine Cook-Catone, who's developed that mindful self-care, she recently did research. She's a yoga instructor and has done a lot of research related to women participating in yoga. And she's even found if you're in a yoga class where the leader does body as process, it's like yoga to feel good, yoga to relax. The women in that class tend to have higher self-esteem than in women who are taking a yoga class with a leader who is all about sculpting the body or doing certain things for certain body parts. That's that body as object. The women who are taking that class tend to have less self-esteem. So even just the approach that the yoga instructor takes can have quite an impact on their audience in that way. So I thought it was really cool research. Eating healthfully, ideally lower fat, higher carbohydrate, getting enough sleep. You college students are notorious for not getting enough sleep. And I think about that as that oxygen mask. I'm really sensitive to lack of sleep and I need a lot of sleep. So I have made that my luxury in life and people just have to deal with it. I tend to get up pretty early, but I don't stay up very late at night at all. Take your oxygen, make sure you're getting enough rest, yeah, take care of yourselves in that way. Any questions here? Okay, some other behaviors that manage stress. Social support, and we talked a little bit the other day. We know that the key to happiness for most individuals is having that emotional intimacy with one other person or other people, emotional intimacy. And so that social support, as well as having people around you, close relationships around you. We know a lot of individuals are suffering during this pandemic because there's not that tendency to have people around quite like we did before the pandemic. So strive for really healthy relationships. The second thing is journal writing. I advocate journal writing for my clients frequently, and I have participated in this. I do this when I'm going through a really tough time in my own life. I don't write on a regular basis. I only write when I feel like I'm going through a tough time and I really need to vent my emotions and I need to process my emotions. I might need to think about my thoughts about people around me that aren't maybe so positive. And I'm trying to kind of process some of those relational issues and whatnot. I find it to be very helpful if you write about facts and emotions and you write about facts and emotions repetitively. This really interesting thing tends to happen. And this is initiated from the research of Jamie Pennybaker. And what Pennybaker found, he had college students their first semester. He randomly assigned half of them to write 4 days in a row for 20 minutes. The control group was write about the stuff in your dorm room. The other group, he had them write 4 days in a row, 20 minutes each, about stressors in their life, about trauma in their life or stressors in their life. And that was one of his original studies. He and then a bunch of others have done, there's a whole body of research on this, the writing cure. What he found was that those who wrote about what was stressful and traumatic had less illness and less medical office visits in their first semester of college than those in the control group who wrote about the stuff in their room. Okay. And when you do a word analysis, and I even see this in my clients when I ask them to do their journal writing, a lot of times people like to type. It's actually a little bit more effective if you do it handwritten, because the handwriting actually kind of helps you slow your thoughts down. You're able to kind of see your thoughts and see your emotions a little bit more effectively when you handwrite than when you type. This really interesting phenomenon occurs, and I've had clients share with me, like when they're doing their journal writing, by looking over their writing, it's almost like a medical doctor looking at an x-ray and the stuff that they can see in an x-ray or an MRI. By looking at the writing, we gain so much information as psychologists. One of the interesting things that occurs, a couple interesting things here, when they're handwriting, when they get to the stuff that's really important, like they're really finally addressing an emotion or thoughts or a memory that's key to their distress, their handwriting goes from nice and neat to big and messy. Okay. And so when we're looking at it, we oftentimes will want to go to where's that big messy part. Okay. Another thing that we glean from that as we're looking at, first of all, we're getting a lot about content of what's stressful in their lives or what was traumatic in their lives. But we're also seeing, are they very cognitive, very factual? Are they, on the other hand, the flip side of that would be it's all about emotions. It's all like, blah, and I feel this way and they did this and I felt this way and blah, and, all that kind of stuff. Or is there a nice balance between understanding their thoughts and being logical and understanding and processing their emotions? And then another thing Penny Baker and other researchers have found over time is that usually when people, it's called opening up would be getting to that stuff that's really kind of key to your distress. There's a lot of emotion words, a lot of like, and I felt this way, and this happened, and I couldn't believe it, and I was crying, I was so sad, blah, blah, and it's all that. Freud would call it a catharsis, getting the emotion out. By day 4, the event, the story, the trauma, the stress, whatever it is, it becomes very linear. And this happened, and I felt this way, and I thought this, and this person said this, and I felt this way, and da, da, da. It becomes much more balanced in thoughts and emotions. And then you start to see by day 4 more action verbs. And the action, this happens naturally. You're not telling people, hey, I want you to write this way on day 1, write this way on day 2. It happens naturally that it goes from processing emotions and getting emotions out to action verbs, moving people into problem solving. Okay. And very much like the classic serenity prayer, the problem solving is like, oh, what I really need to do is stop running up my credit card every month and paying interest. That would be an action verb, problem solving. Other part of the serenity prayer would be, I went through this breakup and this person doesn't want to be with me anymore, and I need to accept that this person doesn't want to be with me anymore. That would be more emotion focused coping. Does that make some sense? Or arriving at some acceptance of like, I can't control that relationship. I can't get that relationship back if that person doesn't want to be with me, type of thing. So again, all that stuff just actually tends to happen naturally with repetitive writing about stress or trauma. Give it a try, y'all, at some point, or when you feel like you need it, give it a try. Exercise, we know, is very effective in helping people manage stress. And like we talked about when we defined stressor, stress perception, and strain, exercise buffers the strain. The more exercise we get on a regular basis, the less likely stress impacts us on a mental level and on a physiological level. I like to take problems when I'm kind of struggling with a decision, or I'm struggling with some kind of problem. I like to take it on a run, or take it on a bike ride, or take it on a hike. And I find it really interesting how upset I am about it, whatever it is, at the start, and how much better I feel about it at the end. It's kind of a little miracle kind of thing that can happen. And in a lot of cases, it's because you get a better perspective, or it moves you into problem solving, or it moves you into acceptance. And one way of thinking about it is, when we exercise, our brain gets extra amount of nutrients, our brain gets extra amount of oxygen. And a well-nourished brain, a well-oxygenized brain is going to be a healthier brain than one that is not oxygenized in that way. Does that make some sense? Just some basic anatomy and physiology there. We know hot showers or baths are nice and relaxing. Making sure that you've got some leisure activities, some things that you enjoy doing. I know when I do academic advising with students, I will oftentimes ask them, particularly if they feel like they're in a major, they're not sure where their career is going. I like to ask them, what do you like to do in your free time? When you're not studying, when you're not being a student in school, what do you like to do? And is there any way we can take what they find themselves doing for fun and meaning and enjoyment? Is there any way we could incorporate that into a career path? Okay. So an example would be psych majors who enjoy producing art or enjoy producing music. Then might they wish to be an art therapist? Might they wish to maybe consider becoming a music therapist, as an example? Incorporating those things. Creativity and having hobbies where you can create can be really healthy for individuals. Solving problems. If people are avoiding solving problems, and then the problems keep building, that's a classic thing we see in clinical psych in our office. We see individuals coming in distressed, complaining about what's going on in their lives, but their anxiety drives so much avoidance that they're not engaging in adequate problem solving. And so we try to move people past those anxious emotions and help them creatively brainstorm ways of problem solving, and then setting goals in how to start engaging in the problem solving so that they can start to put some problems behind them and not have them piling up in front of them. Organization would be, I'm kind of watching the clock here. Organization would be another one. Those of you in this class, I bet you many of you have a calendar. You probably have weekly goals for the type of schoolwork that you do, and work maybe. Many of you probably have daily to-do lists. All of that kind of stuff would be good organization. And the to-do lists are goal setting. And then many of you probably were naturally good at this during the pandemic if you went on lockdown, of structuring your day and creating kind of routine and order and structure in your day. And then I've heard a lot of college students say, that has been really hard for me. I have a hard time getting up at a certain time in the morning. I have a hard time sitting myself down at the computer, and particularly for some individuals, asynchronous lectures are really hard. And then I have other students say, I love the asynchronous lectures because I can, work around it with my work schedule and my leisure schedule. Some students, this comes natural, and for other individuals, we have to help them gain these skills, these organizational skills, these structure your day, these set goals on a regular basis kind of thing. Adjusting your schedule, if you can adjust your schedule in a way that allows for more self-care, allows for time to do some of these different types of things. I know just as a person, I like to exercise in the mornings. Like I do a little bit of work, and then I go and I do my exercise, and then I just have a lot of energy after I exercise. I can concentrate so much better after I exercise. So morning exercise is my deal, but for other people, it might want to get up and do yoga in the morning, or get up and meditate in the morning, that type of thing. We know prayer, there's a lot that happens in prayer for individuals who have the spiritual religious beliefs to pray to God or higher power. There is a sense of connection there for people who believe. There is a venting emotions. There's goal setting that oftentimes occurs in prayer, of like my sister has been going through an illness. She's in my prayers frequently. To know that somebody's praying for you oftentimes feels really good, that people care enough that they are practicing that. There's a lot that's going on in that activity. For people who do not have the religious and spiritual beliefs, this can be done with meditation. That doesn't necessarily have to be talking to God or a higher power. And the thing that happens in meditation, and I would like for you all, I've got a recording where I've walked you through different stress management techniques. I would like for you to play around with that and try that for yourself on your own time. But what happens in meditation is you're doing something repetitive, like focusing on your breath repetitively, saying a particular nonsensical word like repetitively, saying a phrase repetitively. So it could be a spiritual phrase of God grant me peace, God grant me peace, God grant me peace, that type of thing. And what's going to happen when you're repetitively doing that, you're going to start thinking, you're going to have emotions. So it could be something like, let's say I'm sitting and I'm going, oh, we need cat food. Oh crap, I need to get cat food or they're going to eat me tonight. And then it's like, okay, as soon as I thought, oh, my grocery list, I need to get cat food, I wasn't focusing on my breath, or I wasn't focusing on my And then the idea is to rein the mind back in. It's like, okay, cat food, think about that later. What are we going to have for dinner? You realize, okay, that's a thought, or we're running out of toilet paper, or whatever it is. Going back, and it takes time. It's actually meditation. A lot of people think you're just sitting and you're doing nothing. It takes work. It takes work. It takes deliberate work over time, and then the mind can relax and the mind can calm and the thoughts can calm. And does that make some sense? So it's that repetition. Progressive muscle relaxation is when we go through the body, and I've led you through this on that recording, different muscle groups, tensing muscles, relaxing, breathing in between, tensing other muscles, relaxing, breathing in between. PMR is really good for people who have headaches, particularly tension headaches, back pain, and any other kinds of physical pain. PMR can be really good for that. Diaphragmatic breathing, I've led you through this on that. It's when we're breathing with our belly. We're letting our diaphragm really expand, and we're breathing with our belly instead of breathing up here in our chest. If you watch a little baby breathe, they naturally, their little pot bellies, you watch their little bellies just really expand and decline because they're diaphragmatic breathing. Something happens to a lot of us as we go through life, where when things make us scared or anxious, we tend to hold our breath. Like I know when I'm upset, or let's say I'm in a car and somebody cuts me off, I'll do this like kind of thing. And I know I'm not really holding my breath because I haven't died yet. But I have to catch myself doing that kind of breathing type of thing and realize, ooh, I need to relax. I really need to move my breath from my chest down into my diaphragm and breathe. And that's much more relaxing to do that. The imagery is when we activate our mind and we focus on an image and we focus on our senses. And I've led you through that in that practice exercise. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you feel on your skin? What do you taste? What do you smell? When we activate the senses, and you can even see this if you put somebody in a PET scan and you have them do the imagery while they're under the PET scan, it activates and lights up more parts of the brain. It's really nice attention in the brain by evoking our senses. So that's kind of what that does for individuals. The biofeedback is when we use some kind of electronic equipment to give people feedback about their own physiology. So in biofeedback, you can give people feedback about their heart rate, about their blood pressure, about how tense their muscles are. And then what you do is you train them to use that feedback to learn how to really relax their mind and their body, and to actually see through the electronics the effect that they can have on their body. And then the last thing I've got on here would be sex, whether that be with a loving partner, whether that be in masturbation, but there's nothing like a good orgasm or a few orgasms to make somebody feel good. Okay. All right. Thoughts, questions before we conclude today? Are you going to be thinking about stress in life maybe a little bit differently now? Do you have I armed you with some information and some potential skills so that you all can put your oxygen mask on and make sure that you are well oxygenated, healthy, and well before you are trying to take care of others? Cool. Any other thoughts, questions? Any things in terms of stress management that or ideas that help, that we didn't talk about? Things that maybe that you do that we haven't covered in class? Nope. All righty. Well, it's great seeing everybody. We are going to cover next week interpersonal violence and psychological disorders that are more common in women. So that's where we are headed next week. Good to see everybody. Y'all take care. Bye.